are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Trusts and Estates Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to get your week started off right with some new ideas on how to be involved in estate planning and trust and estate administration. And I deal, primarily from the standpoint of people like myself and my guest, Greg Barnsdale, who are professionals involved in helping people with estate planning and trust and estate administration. However, I have many viewers who are working on their own estate plans, or they may be administrating an estate on their own. And so lots of great information here. Gives you an opportunity to talk more intelligently with your advisors and or to take care of those matters for which you're responsible in a better way. So today I'm very pleased to introduce my guest, Greg Barnsdale. Greg is a funeral planner and director, and also he's involved with financial services related to estate planning. And he's written a book called Do Not Ignore Your Mortality. And so I met Greg a while back now, and we had a wonderful conversation, long conversation, longer than we planned actually. And this is a man who has seen the situations that come up in our topic from a lot of different perspectives. Most uniquely being directly involved in funerals. And so I was very anxious to have him as a guest on the show. So Greg, welcome to Trust and Estates Weekly. Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, you're welcome, Kevin. I appreciate your interest and having me as a guest. Thank you.
And I should mention, by the way, that Greg, one more time, we're expanding Trust and Estates Weekly internationally. Greg hails from Canada, our great neighbor to the north, and so it's nice to welcome you for that reason as well, Greg. So tell us, let's start out. I gave just a very brief overview of your background, but fill that in for us, if you will. How did you? Well, this is not directly on topic. I don't imagine, but it could have been the case, I suppose, that growing up as a kid, you're thinking, I think what I want to be is a funeral director. I'm guessing not, right? So, how did you get into that business, and tell us about being that, and then kind of fill us in on the rest of your background.
Well, actually, Kevin, it was just a bit of a fluke how I somewhat fell into it. My family was not involved in the funeral industry at all, and it was a guidance counselor who actually recommended that I consider being a funeral director. And that was really the first time that I had considered it. But oddly enough, my good high school friend Mike ended up working for the local funeral home in the small town where I grew up, vacuuming and just cleaning up and so on. And when I would go and visit him at work, and I got to know some of the people that he had worked with, and there was actually an ambulance service that worked out of the back of the funeral home, which was quite prominent, popular and common at that time. And I got to know some of the people, and I ended up developing a strong interest in it. And shortly after, my grandfather died, and I got to see the process close up.
So I'm curious, if maybe you don't know this, but what was it about you that caused the guidance counselor to say, you need to be in the funeral directing business?
Well, I think, Kevin, it was likely, at least partially, because I was a bit of an introvert and rather quiet. Mm-hmm. I've never been one to really be in the limelight, and this whole role for me as being an author and sharing this whole death positive movement based on what I've experienced in both the funeral and the financial planning industry is really out of the norm for me. But I think it was because of that particular reason.
Gotcha. Well, and that makes sense. And unfortunately, I've been to quite a number of funerals over the years, and it is interesting how a funeral director can both be present but not in any way drawing attention to himself. It seems like a skill, but maybe it's also a way of being. So.
I agree. I think the learnings that I had developed years ago as a young funeral director have stayed with me throughout my life, and they are certainly some great life skills overall. But I'm still licensed today here in Ontario as a funeral director with the Bereavement Authority of Ontario 40 years later.
So a couple of questions come to mind, and you're the only funeral director that I've interviewed on the show. Uh, um, what is it like day after day dealing with people in their bereavement, dealing with remains? How does that affect you? How do you not become, I don't know, serially serially blue, at least, if not, clinically depressed?
Well, I've been asked that question a few times, Kevin, and one of my coworkers years ago at one of the larger funeral homes that I had worked at in Toronto told me that in her opinion, every day that she was off and not working at the funeral home, it gave her the opportunity to really enjoy life and appreciate the life that she has. And that's
Mhm.
one of the things that stuck with me throughout my lifetime is that, this life that we live is really a gift. And the odds that we actually were born apparently are, I forget the figures, but it's hard to put into words how the stars lined up and everything came to fruition for us to actually even be here. But
Mhm.
to appreciate every day that we have is so vitally important. And that business reminds you of that every day. And I didn't find it depressing.
Mm. And how did you develop this? So this is one of, I think, the underappreciated skills that are necessary for people like me who do probate and trust administration. And that is that there is an emotional or even a spiritual component to it, because the reason for the administration and dealing with all the financial issues is that somebody has died. And so uh, to ignore that bereavement may be going on, or candidly, I have had situations where it seemed like the those left behind were joyful that the person was gone, but joyful in a way that wasn't completely devoid of guilt, if you will. So what is it like to deal with people on a regular basis who are going through a bereavement of at least some sort?
Well, I've seen all kinds of situations, Kevin, having worked for large and small funeral homes, as well as for the provincial regulator as an examiner here in Ontario. And I've
Hmm.
also worked as a supervisor at one of the largest mortuaries in Canada that, in one way or another, was dealing and still deals with over 100 deaths per day. And a lot of people have a hard time getting their mind around that, but it's absolutely the case. But
Hmm.
to answer your question more directly, I've seen those types of situations too, where surviving family members are relieved that their loved one has died, and as you get to know them and speak with them about what the deceased has gone through and how they quite often lived a long life and were basically at the point where they were almost ready to die.
Hmm.
It's You see all kinds of things, but you have to remain disattached to a point so you're not as emotionally involved. And I guess that would be similar to anyone in the medical profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So uh, I have to ask you this question because I think people will be curious about this. And especially given the trend toward these sort of customized funerals that are becoming more popular these days. So what is the most unusual service or funeral over which you presided during your years as a funeral director?
Well, one of the more unusual things that I recall, actually, as you had mentioned, was seeing a small boat in a visitation room. The fellow who had died was an avid fisherman, and you're absolutely right. People are customizing the whole end of life experience based on what the situation calls for and what the deceased perhaps wanted. But that's one of the more unusual things I've seen in a visitation room. But one of the more interesting things that I have seen at the time of a death was an older woman that my colleague and I had gone to pick up, and the coroner was there. The police were there, as they often are. And we were led to this apartment where we had brought our stretcher to pick up the deceased and bring her back to the funeral home, or perhaps to the hospital for an autopsy. I don't recall what the situation was in that regard, but she had actually died standing up.
Oh, I've heard of people falling asleep standing up, but that's pretty wild. So the fellow with the boat, was he buried in the boat, or?
No, the deceased was in a casket off to the side, and there were
Oh,
lots of
okay.
flowers and so on. But there was actually a boat with a motor on the back and some of his fishing rods and such, and
Wow.
and that was just part of his story.
All right, so I don't know if you've ever seen the movie SOB, but the main character, the lead character in the movie, dies at one point, and his friends basically steal him from the funeral home to give him a Viking funeral, right? And they put him in his boat, or actually it's the dinghy that's that his yacht carries, and they sort of light it on fire and push it off. And I can imagine people requesting things like that. But so as I recall, after years of being a funeral director, you then moved into the realm of financial services. So what prompted you to take that step and broaden your horizons, I would think?
Well, Kevin, I wanted something more lively.
Mm.
Just kidding. I wanted a change. And actually, my father had been in the financial services industry for some time, and a growing number of other people that I knew at the time, and I was looking for a change. So I kept my funeral director's license that I had, as I had mentioned earlier. I still have it today, 40 years later. But I just wanted another challenge. And as I got working in the financial services industry, I realized that I could take that experience of being a funeral director and bring it into the role of being a financial advisor. And I did. I told all of my clients what I used to work at, and then ultimately help them with their retirement planning, their investments, and their RRSP planning, which is very similar to your 401k type of plan, and also to help mitigate the risks in their life of what could derail a good retirement. And a premature death or a critical illness or a disability could certainly do that. But I found the same sort of frustration that many people didn't want to talk about it.
The same sort of frustration. How? I guess.
Well, in the funeral industry, I saw rather quickly that the vast majority of situations, and I'm sure it's still the case today, although I'm not working actively in the funeral industry anymore, but from what I'm hearing from colleagues and so on, and reading about too, the vast majority of people are just poorly prepared for that sort of event to happen in their life.
Gotcha.
And the situations that I had seen in the funeral industry where people had these open discussions and they knew what the deceased wanted, and plans had been put in place. There was a will and all these sorts of things. Beneficiary designations were updated, and you could tell rather quickly that they were much more organized. The situation for the surviving family members where things were organized were just so much easier on them.
Right.
And the same frustration that I had found within the financial services industry, when people were more interested in talking about their investments than they were about the things that could get in the way of a good retirement, like a premature death.
So let's dig into this a little bit more, because I think this is important. People who have not been through this process of having a loved one die, and having to see to it that they're buried. There's a funeral, and this sort of transition period immediately following the death of a loved one. So, what are some of the problems that arise, especially when there hasn't been planning or when there hasn't been adequate planning? What is somebody what is somebody going to be faced that's going to make this time of grieving even more difficult, because on top of it have been added all of these logistical or other types of responsibilities?
Well, there are a number of things that I'm sure you have probably heard about and witnessed perhaps as well, Kevin. From one of the most common things is locating the will, the most current version of the deceased will. That can be a wild goose chase on its own, and quite often when we were helping families out at the time of the initial arrangements at the funeral home, they hadn't got to the point of actually locating the will at that time. They were just more interested in arranging the funeral so that they could tell their friends and relatives when the visitation started and where the funeral was going to be and such. And that made perfect sense. But the next step after that was quite often to locate that will and discuss with other family members and so on as to who was going to be involved in preparing food and all these different things, notifying other people and how to do that, which more and more families do online today as opposed to the traditional route of a newspaper obituary. But there's the other issue of control. If there's no will in place and these conversations have not been proactively discussed in advance while the deceased was alive, which all too often happens, people quite often have different ideas and what they think should be the case. And quite often, when there's no planning done, they're actually setting up their families for quite a big mess.
So when you say they have different ideas about what ought to be done, you mean do you mean with respect to the funeral arrangements? And so what are some of those issues that you've seen end up in dispute because either the will was not identified before before the arrangements for the services were done, or because there was no plan left behind?
Well, that actually covers the whole waterfront, actually, Kevin, from everything as basic as not knowing if the deceased wanted actually to be buried or cremated. And now there are more options, such as human composting and recycling. But again, it's so vitally important that people discuss these things while minds are clear and time is plentiful with their family, because having these proactive conversations, although they're not easy, it's the lesser of two evils. But to answer your question more directly, there are a wide array of things that can actually cause ill feelings and arguments and fights among family members, from investment accounts to insurance policies to various things around the house, and people having perhaps different ideas as to who gets what. That's why it's so important to have these discussions in advance and let people know what you want and be upfront with them.
Right. No, I guess I want to stay focused for a minute on your previous role as a funeral director. So what are the issues surrounding that aspect? Because the way this is what I've seen in the past, so you'll understand where the question is coming from past, and that is what happens with the post-death arrangements vis-a-vis the funeral, the service, whatever, oftentimes set the tone for everything else that comes afterwards. So if the funeral arrangements and the service and all that goes relatively smoothly, so then it seems like people are heading in a reasonably good direction, and there's less of a chance that these other issues you just mentioned are going to cause conflict. On the other hand, if conflict starts immediately with things like, I don't know, choosing a casket, for example, it seems like that kind of dissension continues on, through the entire administration of the decedent's estate. So that's why. What are sort of the key issues that someone ought to plan and socialize with his family or his, the loved ones he's leaving behind, with respect to a funeral or a committal or whatever is done, that in your experience have perhaps caused dissension among those who are left behind, for want of a better term?
I think really what you're getting at, Kevin, is really the essence of why I published this book. I struggled for years to find a way that would truly impact a lot of people. Yet I was challenged with the whole issue of writing a book, Kevin, that I knew many people didn't even want to discuss.
Mm-hmm.
Yet I knew these points were so important, and I took a lot of time to write this book, actually following the advice of a dragon, which is the forerunner to your Shark Tank. I'm sure you've heard of Dragon's Den here in Canada, but I followed the teachings of one of the most successful nonfiction authors who helped change the face of retirement planning 25 years ago. And I'm hoping to help change the face of post-retirement planning, as I call it. But the essence of this book really gets to the point that you had just mentioned. The very first chapter stresses the point about communication and talking with one's family about what one really wants to do. The second chapter talks about the very basics of having a will and why it's so vitally important. And then it gets into the very basics of estate planning and power of attorney planning and those sorts of things. But the most vitally important point is for people to realize that if they don't have a valid will in place, things can go awry very, very quickly. And that's one of the most important things that I stress within this planning, as well as the fact that this is not just for older people. Death is around us all the time, but people seem to have this thought in their head that it's not going to happen to me when they hear of bad things happening. It's going to happen to someone else. And that's just not always the case.
Okay, let's take a quick sponsor break, and then we'll come back and pick up on your book. When life brings unexpected changes, managing inherited property shouldn't add to your stress. Magnum Properties specializes in probate and trust real estate management. We handle the complexities while you focus on what matters most. From property maintenance to tenant relations, from legal compliance to maximizing value, we're your trusted partner through every step. Magnum Properties, Inc., turning property challenges into peace of mind. Call us today at 213-264-4396 or visit magnumprops.com. So this is Trust and Estates Weekly, and I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel. My guest is Greg Barnsdale, who has been a funeral director as well as involved in financial planning. And he wrote a book called Don't Ignore Your Mortality. And right before the break, we started talking about Greg's book. So, Greg, you mentioned kind of in passing what motivated you to write the book. Climb into that a little bit more for us, if you would. I mean, I've written a book. It's a huge undertaking, a lot of work. And the fact of the matter is, contrary to what people think, very few people make any kind of substantial money these days off of writing a book. The economics of book writing just mitigates against it. And, even a bestseller, which in the United States means the book has sold at least 10,000 copies, but the author is probably going to get maybe about $1, maybe $2 per copy. So we're talking $10,000 to $20,000, right? So that's compared to the number of hours it took to write the book. You're probably not even earning minimum wage. So what was it that compelled you to write your book and take the kind of time and make the commitment that such an endeavor takes?
The reason, Kevin, was really born out of frustration with what I had seen in both the funeral and the financial planning industry. And I knew from what I had seen from other people going through situations that many of them were very sour, that could have been much better just with a bit of planning. I wanted to create a message that I knew would really help a lot of people. And that's really why I created this book, was to inspire people to pull out their will and read the darn thing. And if they don't have one, to understand the many problems that can arise by not having a will.
And so, as we've talked about so far in the show, a lot of people just don't want to come to terms with their own mortality, right? And that's probably the single most common reason why people don't create an estate plan. So what is it about your book, do you think, that will help people overcome the reluctance to engage in an investigation of that, or the process that is, that issue?
Well, I basically take real life experience, Kevin, from both the funeral and the financial planning industry, and just openly tell people with a bit of dry humor to make it a little more appealing, because yes, it is the most unappealing topic I think there is out there. But I think I have successfully done that. I have followed the teachings of a dragon, as I said, one of the most successful nonfiction authors um, in history, I believe. But I've created a message that truly is inspiring people to be more engaged in this. And actually, what I've learned over the last couple of years since publishing is that I'm stressing this message on LinkedIn, and it has allowed me to recently surpass over 11,000 followers. But I'm stressing the fact that end of life planning helps reduce the stress of aging. It leaves survivors more financially and emotionally resilient, more likely to get along, and less likely to contest final wishes. It naturally results in more meaningful legacies, often helps charities because of the immense tax planning benefits of planned giving. It always takes pressure off the courts from otherwise needing to be involved in unorganized estates, and all these things help bolster the economy.
So give us an example of one of the stories that you relate in the book from your actual experience that helps people better come to terms with handling these issues.
Well, I don't know if I mentioned this specific story. I think I did in the book. I need to reread my book again soon, as my publishing coach suggests. But I recall one distinct weekend working in one of the large funeral homes in Toronto, and we received a call from a son who was on his way from, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours away to come to the funeral home. His dad had just died, and he said, "I have my father's most recent will. If my brother calls, don't talk to him. I have the will." And then he asked, "Has my brother contacted you?" And I said, "No, you're the first contact we've heard about this particular death." And so we finished our call and hung up. And a short time later, the brother called, and I happened to pick up the phone, and I was speaking with him, and he had a very similar message. And so obviously, these two brothers were not speaking to each other, or if they were, it was very limited. But with all the estrangement going on within families, which was all too common that we saw within many surviving family members, that's just another flashpoint. It seems that it is a contributing factor to the types of situations when there is no communication and no plan in place as to what is to happen and who's in charge. Things can go awry quickly.
So let's take this case where you have conflicting instructions from, two surviving family members. As a funeral director, what do you do?
It's a growing issue, Kevin. Actually, when I was working actively in the funeral industry, we had to be very careful, and I'm sure this is still the case today, that funeral directors everywhere have to be very careful that they're taking the advice and direction from those that actually are qualified to be basically in charge. So I wouldn't be surprised if funeral homes now are actually asking for a copy of the will indicating who the executor is, and for that executor to provide identification.
And in this story that you just related, how did you resolve that situation where you have two people both claiming to have, the genuine will, right? I mean, are you saying, well, submit both your wills and we'll have our attorney review it? And I mean, that would seem to be, a pretty costly endeavor for a funeral home. How did you end up resolving that situation?
Kevin, I don't recall the specific details of how it was resolved, but it's again, it's a growing issue. If there's an older copy of a will and perhaps a newer one naming a different executor, uh, these things have to be sorted out and sorted out properly. And I would imagine many funeral homes are reluctant to really get into the nuances of being involved in that. Although at the same time, as I said, they have to be very, very careful that they're taking the instructions, and the person signing off on that funeral services contract is the one authorized to pay for it.
So, and I understand you don't, you don't recall the circumstance of that, but is it possible that a funeral home would be forced to just tell the people, look, we're getting conflicting instructions. We can't handle this burial because the liability for, taking incorrect direction is too high, and so you'll have to go somewhere else. I mean, is that a possibility?
Well, it's very possible, yes, and I would imagine that funeral homes are occasionally having to say to surviving family members, "Please go and sort this out with your lawyer,
Hmm.
and then come back, call us, and we'll set up another appointment to follow through. But we need to make sure that we are following the proper instructions accordingly."
Well, and so that brings up the issue that now, because there either hasn't been proper planning or it wasn't properly socialized with the surviving family members, so now additional legal expense is being incurred by, you know, needing lawyers to sort this out. In the meantime, the burial is delayed, everything's up in the air, and all of that adds to the aggravation and et cetera, on top of just the overall situation, and it inflames what's going on.
Absolutely, and that's again the whole crux of this type of message. I think, Kevin, is that planning one's end of life should not be done at the end of life. We should take the time when minds are clear and time is plentiful to have these sensitive conversations that we love and care about most, because we all want what is best, especially for those that we love.
Mhm.
And this, I truly do think in my heart that this is one of the ultimate gifts of love.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because I agree. Uh, it's a way to show loved ones that you care about them once you're gone, right? And so it's kind of a final statement of the level of care and concern that a person has for, for his family. So I know for myself, it because I'm in this business. Um, I've talked to my members of my family who I want to be, handling certain things, and they find it very uncomfortable, right? And I say to them, well, look, this is the reality. Is
Yeah.
one day, hopefully it'll be a long time from now. I'm not going to be alive anymore. That no one has gotten out of this world alive yet that we know of, with the possible exception, I suppose, of Jesus, if one is a Christian. Um, but that is just the reality, and is what I've found is, as much as individuals are reluctant to deal with their own mortality, their loved ones oftentimes don't want to contemplate that either. And so the two become somewhat self-reinforcing. And so the conversations and the planning never takes place. So what do you suggest for people who they do want to plan and they do want to make this expression of caring for their loved ones, but they're getting pushback from the loved ones themselves about dealing with this? What recommend, as someone who's seen this across, a range of disciplines within the field, what do you recommend people do in a situation like that?
In my book, I have some questions that will help readers and listeners have a more meaningful conversation with their loved ones. And I have some tips as well that I purposely discuss about how to get over those types of reluctance from other family members, because I've seen it many times too. But I've also created a list of 30 curated questions, Kevin, that I have available on my website, do not ignore your mortality.com. And under the resources tab is what I call the probing legacy questions, where I have 15 questions for very basic initial conversations, and then another 15 questions for more advanced type of situations. Because I get it. I know that people quite often have a hard time with this point, is just getting the momentum going.
Mm-hmm. So give us an example of one of those questions, if you would, so people can get a sense of how these probing questions will help them deal with an uncomfortable topic.
Sure. Well, one of the questions that I had heard in the financial services industry in relation to life insurance was one of the ones that I had used, and it goes something along the lines of, if I died last night, who do you think is best prepared to settle my affairs?
Mm.
So that's one question. And another one is, I've been thinking more about my life and my legacy. Could we take some time to discuss these things? They're important to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think positioning these types of sensitive topics in those types of ways, Kevin, make it a little easier for people to engage with you.
So it seems to me the sort of connecting tissue between both of those questions, and maybe this is what you're driving at, is the person who needs to do the planning is really looking, or at least positioning himself as wanting his loved one's help, as opposed to, saying, okay, here's what's going to happen, this is what you're going to do, that kind of thing. Does that sound correct? Or how does that sound with respect to the overall philosophy of your book?
Well, yes, it does. I think in bringing our family members into this conversation in a gentle and caring way, showing care and respect and sensitivity toward them, is the way to go about this, as opposed to saying, well, this is what I've done, and this is who's in charge, and this is who's going to get what. I don't think that is the best way to go about it. And actually, it has me thinking about a movie that I had seen years ago with James Garner called The Ultimate Gift. And there are more and more mortality type of movies like this than ever, it seems. But I think that is the best way to go about it. Yes.
So, and what is someone who needs to do this planning? What do you recommend they do if they already know that members of their family are at odds, and so to engage in that is going to mean to wade into that conflict?
Well, and that's why, Kevin, many people just kick this can down the road and think, I don't. I'm sure the thinking generally is, I'm not ready to discuss this yet. I'm still fine. I'm still here today. I'll put it off for now and get to it when I get around to it. And by the way, I do have round to it's too, to help people, embrace this whole message and get moving with it. But you're right. These sorts of things that actually, your comment just now had me thinking about a survey that I had seen not long ago, put out by a bank here in Canada, that a relatively high number of adult Canadians are putting off these types of conversations because they think that it will bring up conflict within their family. So they just don't have the conversations.
Well, and no, and I get that. For people who are looking for a reason not to do it, there's lots of ways to rationalize not doing it. But let's take someone who does want to engage in this process, and they don't have to be afraid it's going to raise conflict, because conflict already exists between family members. So, what can they do to nonetheless engage in the process that they want to engage in, i.e., end of life planning and you know drafting a will and all that kind of stuff, while you know dealing with the issue that that they know already exists, which is maybe they've got two children who, for various reasons, are not speaking to each other, and yet, whatever decisions are made need to be socialized with both children. So, what does someone do? How should someone handle that situation in order to at least they're probably not going to solve the conflict, especially if it's been going on a long time, but at least minimize the additional conflict that might arise as a result of their passing away?
A growing number of people, Kevin, are getting involved in leveraging family offices. Family offices tend to help people of a higher net worth, especially business owner clients who have more at stake and such with their situation. And I understand that not everyone can afford this sort of thing, but if they can, that can be a great solution to actually have a mediated type of meeting to bring everyone together with a lawyer and financial advisor and perhaps an accountant to help these types of issues get out onto the table and have them discussed and appropriately planned for. But in the situations where people are working on a budget and still have that type of situation going on in their family, I think it is also a good idea to perhaps have their lawyer involved or perhaps their financial advisor, maybe not to the same extent of leveraging a family office. But if that is not the case, perhaps bringing another friend or close outside relative, more of a distant relative in, or perhaps a couple of people to help act as a moderator might be helpful.
Okay, very good. Let's take another break. Probate and Trust TV, your curated source for the most useful and insightful content on estate planning and trust and probate administration, featuring standout professionals like Bill Gross, Paul Brabelet, James Cunningham, and yours truly. Whether you're a lawyer, accountant, real estate professional, or working on your own succession plan, this channel helps you quickly find the clearest, most practical content YouTube has to offer. Subscribe now to Probate and Trust TV. Spend more time learning, less time searching. So my guest on Trust and Estates Weekly is Greg Barnsdale, former funeral director and financial advisor and author of Don't Ignore Your Mortality. And we've been talking about what someone can do to get out of the mindset of avoiding end of life planning and estate planning, and more particularly dealing with the kind of conflict that might arise from going through that process. So Greg, I think, by the way, I think that's a great idea. To essentially, when you already have family members who are in dispute, that are in dispute for nothing related to the estate planning process and such, to bring in someone or more than one person to be a mediator, or someone like a lawyer, an accountant, who their presence may cause the people in dispute to pause before they start yelling and screaming, and the kind of untoward behavior that might arise if only close family members are there. I would also, by the way, for people who are involved in a church or a synagogue, whatever. So you can always also consider bringing in your pastor or someone like that. They don't have the expertise, of course, necessarily in estate planning, but to the extent that they know the people involved, most pastors, priests, rabbis are pretty skilled in mediating conflict, and so they can focus on the conflict mediation, and then other people can perhaps provide the kind of advice that's necessary to to make the decisions, to discuss the decisions, and help make the decisions that need to be made. So, aside from people's reluctance to engage in the process at all, what do you see as being the top three issues with which people should deal as they get involved in end of life and estate planning?
Well, I'm going to mention one point briefly first, Kevin, and it relates back to the topic we just spoke of.
Mhm.
And I think it's important for me to stress this at this time. But I'm sure you're well aware of this, but I want to make sure that your listeners are too. Is that these types of very, very personal and deeply intimate conversations about one's purpose in life and the legacy they want to leave and what they want to be remembered for, these types of very sensitive conversations tend to bring people together. And that's where I've seen this before too, where people who were initially miles apart quite often will come together in regards to that greater purpose.
Interesting point. Yes, yeah, and I can see that, right? Because I know my older sister and I are going through a number of issues for members of our family, and as we get to know more about these family members, our family's history, it's bringing us closer together because it gives us a greater understanding of who we've become as people as well. So I think
Right.
that's a very powerful point that you make.
Yes, thank you. And to answer your question, Kevin, if I understand it correctly, the other major points that people should be focusing on is as I stress within my book, it's communicating with other family members about what one wants to have happen when they die, or even if they become incapacitated and can't speak for themselves, as to who's to be in charge and who's to speak up for them.
Mhm.
But also the fact of, do they want to be buried? Do they want to be cremated? Do they want to be recycled or composted? There are far more options available today than ever before.
Mhm.
But these types of conversations with family members should lead to some planning and plans to be in place, and other family members to know exactly what is to be done when that time comes.
Mhm.
Because all of us will die, and many of us will be incapacitated at some point. I was 2 months after I published the book, I was almost incapacitated with a brain tumor that I was diagnosed with, and
Mhm.
it was a huge shock to me, but I had no idea that was around the corner.
Well, and so that raises another good point, which is that kind of incapacitation can come absolutely without warning, and then it may be too late, right? So there, the best time to this is what I've told people on occasion. The best time to engage in estate planning is 5 years ago. The next best time is right now, right?
Right.
Same as with investing, right? The best time to start investing is 20 years ago, but the next best time is right now, and it's not, I think, overblown to stress that kind of urgency, especially if nothing has been done to date.
Yes, absolutely, Kevin. And so many people are just putting this off. Roughly, only about half of the adult population here in Canada has a valid will, and I believe the statistics in the U.S. are the same. And in many other parts of the world, the statistics are terrible too. But isn't it a shame that we live in one of a couple of the most progressive countries on the planet, yet so many people are putting off these types of conversations? I read a survey recently that indicated that here in Canada, that even though the vast majority of people do not want to leave a burden for their children when they die, and they want to set them up in the best position possible, yet an Angus Reid survey revealed that less than 30% of the adults here in Canada have a comprehensive estate plan.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the same is true here in the United States. I think I believe the figure is 68% of people over 60 have a will or at least some kind of estate plan. And uh, look, I don't like to think that over 60 is old, because I am over 60, but the reality is, it's I don't want to say it's old in the sense of death is necessarily imminent, but certainly for people who are 60 or older, they should have an estate plan in force. the chances that someone under 30 is going to die are certainly much lower than that someone over 60 is going to die. But as you go down the age cohorts, the percentage that have a will or any kind of estate plan here in the United States declines pretty rapidly. So I think someone told me recently the overall figure in the United States is somewhere around 30% when you take all age cohorts.
Right.
So that's shockingly low, and I think either people don't know or they don't want to deal with the fact, and I don't know if this is the same in Canada, but here in the United States, if someone dies without an estate plan, a will, a trust, whatever, so whatever property they leave behind is going to be divided up according to the law of the state in which they were a resident. And that may not at all conform to the decedent's wishes. So what is the situation for someone in Canada who dies intestate?
Well, intestate deaths that I believe, Kevin, around the world to a large degree are much the same, in the sense that if you don't have a valid will when you die, the government has one for you, and chances are you're not going to like it, but you're going to be dead. You had your chance, and that's really the cold reality of this. Right. And yes, your assets will ultimately go to your family based on the rules of that particular jurisdiction of where you lived, but you have the government involved in your affairs. It slows things down. It's more costly, and also a will is a public record. I think most people would be shocked if they knew how easy it was to pull up a deceased person's will online and read all the details of it. I don't think most people would want their will available to anyone to look up online like that. But a
Right.
will is a public document, and that's why trusts are so important, because trusts, as you know, provide a lot of many benefits, and privacy being one of them.
Right. Yeah, and to be clear, so people understand, a will becomes public once it's been submitted for probate, at least here in the United States, because then it becomes part of the court record. And in general, court records are available to anyone who cares to view them. And at least here in Los Angeles County, pay roughly $1 per page, to buy a particular document. But so it's not available for anyone to view prior to that. Nonetheless, and this is why some of these very high-profile cases, reporters are able to get a hold of the decedent's will, is because once it's submitted for probate, it's unless there's been a request to keep it sealed, to keep the court record sealed, and the judge doesn't have to grant that particular request, as I understand it. It's going to be public record. Whereas you're right, a trust, unless there's some dispute that leads to the trust being litigated, the trust itself will not become, as a matter of routine, public record. So, that sense of privacy that I think a lot of us have about these kind of issues can be pretty easily violated, if you will, by improper planning.
Yes, and again, it comes back to this whole issue, Kevin, of good timing. We don't know what's ahead of us. I had no idea that I would be diagnosed with this brain tumor 2.5 years ago, and we just can't predict the future. But if I didn't mention this earlier, I want to stress this again, because I think it's vitally important. I worked as a supervisor with one of the largest mortuaries in Canada, and this organization still to this day, as far as I know, deals with over 100 deaths each and every day. Mm-hmm. I've worked on the front lines with forensics and police, and seen all kinds of things that would make people's hair curl. But death is around us all the time, yet so many people have this mindset, well, estate planning is just for older people, and it's just for people with money. Mm-hmm. But people can set up a will online these days. But as I stress in the book, there are cautions with that.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Well, it sounds like this particular mortuary was similar to the VA here in the United States. So veteran VA cemeteries, I would venture to say they may do, especially the larger ones, may do more than 100 committals a day. I mean, it happens on a, as distasteful as this sounds, almost an industrial, scale process. So, this is the reality of life. Is a lot of people die, and they have to be that has to be dealt with. So, in my own life, I'll share a brief example. So when my father passed away, I was stationed overseas with the military, and so one of my relatives handled the funeral arrangements. I was helping from overseas while working to get my family, make arrangements for my family to come to the United States for the funeral. And the end result was the wrong religious symbol was put on my father's headstone. But I didn't find that out until because the headstone wasn't set on the day of the funeral. That's typically not done. So I went to go visit my father's grave a year later. No, I take that back. It was a couple of years later because I had to go back to Japan. But a couple of years later, I went to go visit my father's grave, and I found the wrong religious symbol was on his headstone. And because I wasn't the one who had made the original arrangements, they would not let me change it to the correct one. And the relative who did make the mistake doesn't want to correct it. So, there you go. And God bless him. I think my father just felt like there isn't really anything for me to plan for. I don't really have any significant assets, and whatever property I have, my girlfriend, she's going to get it. And, Kevin will take care of me, right? Kind of thing. But, even in something as simple as that, and this problem has persisted now since 2009 when he passed away. So these are the kind of things that happen without proper planning. So Greg, we're coming to the end of our time together. What closing thoughts do you have for viewers and listeners as you contemplate continuing to bring your message to people?
Well, this message, Kevin, is all part of the death positive movement, which is gaining a lot of traction. And I would urge people not to put off this planning. And I know this sounds like a very biased opinion here, but this is exactly why I wrote this book. Do Not Ignore Your Mortality: Practical Advice from a Funeral and Financial Insider is really just to inspire readers and listeners to lean into this process while minds are clear and time is plentiful. And there are many people out there willing and able to help you, but understanding the fundamentals of how the industry works, and the glossary at the back has a number of terms and definitions that are highly regarded. It's a good motivator.
Very good. Well, Greg, thank you very much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I haven't read your entire book, but I've read parts of it. I thank you for sending it to me, and I can make the shameless plug for you, which is that Greg's book is loaded with outstanding information. And if you have absorbed Greg's message, so a great place to start investigating how to handle this issue is to get a copy of Greg's book. Greg, where can people get a copy of the book?
They can find it pretty well everywhere, Kevin. It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Apple iTunes. But I suggest people go to my website, donotignoreyourmortality.com, and they can find everything there, including much more.
Okay, so after this episode posts on my YouTube channel, you'll see in the show notes, I'll put a link to Greg's website. So you can just go right into the show notes, click through, and see not only the information on the website, but I suspect there's links to the various places where people can get a copy of the book. And if they have additional questions and such, I imagine that there's a way that they can be in touch with you as well.
Yes, there is.
Absolutely. Well, terrific. So, Greg, again, thank you so much for joining me. So, just wrapping up here real quickly, because we're running out of time. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. And then on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then a week from today, I'll be back with the next edition of Trust and Estates Weekly. So I thank you so much for joining Greg and me today. Especially we had some live viewers checking us out here. And hopefully I'll see you again later this week. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, links to my social media will be in the show notes, and feel free to post them there. So Greg, one last time, thank you so much for coming on Trust and Estates Weekly. Really appreciate the conversation we had together. And signing off, as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.